a young girl was found in her own apartment. The police began an investigation that eventually became the longest in the area. Over the years, there have been many shocking twists and turns in the case, but it was only 46 years later that everyone learned the unexpected truth. Lindy Bickler was born on January 31, 1956 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When she was little, her parents divorced, and the girl remained to live with her mother. Her father started a new family, but continued to see his daughter regularly. Soon he had a son, with whom Lindy also constantly communicated. After high school, she attended Millersville State College, located just 10 minutes from home. At the age of 19, Lindy met a guy named Philip Bickler, and the couple soon got married. He also took courses at the college while working for a car rental company. Lindy herself worked part-time at a local flower shop. After their wedding, they rented an apartment in a complex located just a few minutes from the college. The newlyweds began an independent life together and were happy with each other. However, almost immediately after the move, Lindy's happiness was doomed by a series of unpleasant events. She began to notice that in this residential complex someone was constantly watching her, but she never managed to see who it could be. The girl often complained to friends and relatives, but they attributed what was happening to stress after the move. One evening, when Lindy was home alone, she noticed a man looking at her through the glass door panels. The apartment was on the first floor, and her husband was at work at that moment. The man immediately fled, leaving Lindy terrified. Since then, the girl was afraid to be at home alone, but because of Philip's evening schedule, she often had to be alone until dark. Lindy was constantly stressed, and any incident could bring her to panic. Shortly after this event, she spent time with her brother and his family at their home. At some point, the sound of breaking glass was heard on the second floor. It turned out that the wall mirror fell to the floor and broke. The girl was scared to such an extent that she began to shake. She asked her relatives to go around the entire house and make sure that no strangers had entered there. All this stress was the result of an unknown man being able to watch her for months. But all her friends still believed that the girl was worried too much and was not in any real danger. On December 5, 1975, Lindy finished her shift at the flower shop. On the way home, she visited her husband at work, after which she went shopping at a local store. Around this time, her uncle and aunt went to their son's basketball game and decided to invite Lindy along. They knew that the girl was afraid to stay at home alone and decided to distract her for a few hours. They arrived at her apartment at approximately 8:45 p.m. The aunt went to the door and found that it was open. This immediately alerted the woman, and she went inside. Walking into the living room, the aunt saw an overturned lamp on the floor. But the worst thing awaited her in the kitchen. Lindy's body lay there. The girl was lying face down with no signs of life, and in her neck was a meat hatchet, the handle of which was wrapped in a towel. The aunt immediately called the police, and detectives began examining the crime scene. The first thing they noticed was that Lindy was fully clothed, which cast doubt on the motive behind the rape. No valuables were also missing from the apartment, and the possibility of robbery was ruled out. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door or windows. This meant that Lindy might have known the attacker and let him in voluntarily, or he might have entered the apartment while the door was unlocked. The fact is that the girl bought a lot of groceries and physically could not carry all the packages from the parking lot to the house at one time. Perhaps her killer entered the house just after she had delivered the first part of her shopping and went to the car for the second. While the police were examining the crime scene, the girl's husband and parents had already been informed about what had happened. Detectives also had to restrain them as grief-stricken relatives could not believe she had died and wanted to see the girl. Forensic scientists found traces of blood on the floor and walls, but at the time they were unable to match these samples to the victim's DNA. However, they concluded that Lindy fought her attacker to the last. A man's shoe print was also found in one of the rooms. Forensic experts found that the girl received 19 blows with a sharp object. and the perpetrator used 2 knives. He took the meat hatchet from Lindy's kitchen, but the second weapon was never found. They later confirmed that the victim was, after all, subjected to violence. But then they were unable to extract a DNA sample from the criminal. However, in those years he could not have helped much. The police hoped that they would be able to find witnesses, but none of her neighbors were at home at the time of the murder. Other residents did not notice anything suspicious, but several people reported seeing a vehicle in the complex's parking lot. He stood there from approximately 7 to 8:40 p.m., which coincides with the time of Lindy's murder. In addition, none of the residents knew the owner of this car. Unfortunately, detectives were unable to locate her and moved on to another line of investigation. As usually happens in such cases, one of the suspects was the victim's husband. Despite the fact that Philip was at work and had a solid alibi, investigators did not rule out his possible involvement. Over the next few months, detectives interviewed about 300 people who had at least the slightest chance of being involved in the murder. But all this brought no results. At some point, they began to suspect a local serial rapist who had committed several attacks on women around the same time Lindy was killed. However, they were unable to find any evidence that could be linked to the case, and the criminal himself died while trying to escape from prison. In addition, investigators found out that he was at work at the time of the murder. Ultimately, he was no longer considered a suspect. 4 months after the murder, a new twist appeared in this case. 25 kilometers from Lindy's apartment, a 43-year-old woman named Mary was killed. She received many blows with a sharp object, and detectives immediately noticed that these murders were almost 100% similar. But soon the criminal was caught, and investigators were unable to find any connection between him and Lindy. The man admitted to killing Mary, but denied involvement in other crimes. After this, the police did not have a single lead, and the case froze for a year. On December 26, 1976, her relatives went to visit Lindy's grave in the local cemetery. Approaching it, they saw that the tombstone was covered with red paint and badly scratched. They immediately reported this to the police, but they were unable to find the vandals. Investigators concluded that the girl's killer could have been behind the desecration of the grave, since no other tombstone was damaged. Damage Corrector also supported this theory. In addition to the obvious association with red paint, the criminal clearly felt anger towards the deceased. Using a knife or sharp object, he had to spoil the stone for quite a long time in order to completely cover it with deep scratches. Just a few weeks after this, an even stranger event occurred. The police chief, Donald Schiller, whose department was investigating Lindy's murder, received an anonymous letter on 2 pages. The first part was written from the killer's point of view. In this message, he mocked the policeman for still not being able to catch him. The author took responsibility for the defacement of Lindy's grave, and also demanded that this letter be published in tomorrow's local newspapers. In exchange for this, she did not promise to think about surrendering to the police. Then he decided to voice several of his signs to help investigators establish his identity. According to the author, his height was 178 centimeters, weight 93 kilograms. He lived in the western suburbs of Lancaster, had a good job, and was single. Several years ago, he was charged with possession of prohibited substances, and on the day of the murder he was also under the influence of drugs. The last part of the letter was actually a plea for help. The unknown author asked to catch him as soon as possible before he kills someone else. On the second sheet was another letter, supposedly written by a friend of the killer named Jenny Scrum. She wrote that her friend was really going to give up as soon as his letter was published in the newspapers, and added that the man was mentally ill. She allegedly wrote this message while he was sleeping, after which she put the sheet in an envelope. The police admitted that the authors might indeed be Lindy's killer, but they did not believe the second part about his girlfriend. Despite the fact that the text was written in a different handwriting, investigators believe that the criminal could have asked someone he knew to write it all, or he forged the handwriting in some other way. They also failed to notice the similarity of this message with the letters sent by the serial killer nicknamed the Zodiac. He operated in the 60s and 70s in California, regularly communicating with police and newspapers through anonymous text messages. Investigators even admitted that it was he who could have killed Lindy. But this version was very far-fetched. Firstly, the killer was operating in the opposite end of the country. Secondly, at the time of Lindy Zodiac's death, according to the police, he had already retired. Donald Schiller decided not to publish the letter in newspapers, as the author requested. At that time, the police had 2 suspects and did not want to compromise the investigation. The detectives did not believe that the criminal would surrender, and did not see any point in scaring residents with a letter from a mad maniac. Eventually, they began to doubt that the author was indeed the Lindy killer. The letter did not contain a single detail that had not yet appeared in the newspapers. The police profiler even suggested that the author of both sheets could be a woman with mental disabilities who had nothing to do with this case. He made this conclusion after analyzing the writing style. Despite this, investigators found a woman named Jenny Scrum, and after talking with her, they came to the conclusion that she had nothing to do with these letters. At this point, the police ran out of any serious leads, but continued to investigate the case. At different stages, they had new suspects. Lindy's mother's boyfriend, a regular visitor to the flower shop where she worked, and even one of the investigators on the case. After a short investigation, detectives came to the conclusion that all of them were in no way involved in the murder. In 1980, the police got another chance to solve the case. Serial killer Gerald Stan was arrested in Florida and confessed to killing 41 people. At the time of Lindy's death, his father lived just 10 minutes from her complex. Therefore, detectives admitted that Stan could be the killer. But they could not find any evidence that the man had visited his father, and soon he was no longer considered as a suspect. In 1997, experts were able to extract a male DNA profile after finding traces of semen on a victim's underwear. This sample did not match any of the suspects that investigators had for 23 years. Since then, the police have not had a single serious lead, and this case has been shelved for a long time. It was revised in 2000, but to no avail. That same year, detectives decided to publish a letter allegedly written by the killer in newspapers. They hoped that this would help them get new leads, but it didn't happen. The girl's parents never waited for the truth of her murder to come out. Lindy's father passed away in 2000, and her mother in 2007. The next major breakthrough happened only in 2019. After the next resumption of this case, investigators decided to turn to the private Parabon Laboratory, which is engaged in genetic research and has repeatedly helped solve similar cases. Using an innovative method called DNA phenotyping, experts were able to create a rough portrait of Lindy's killer at ages 25 and 60. This method works something like this. Parabon studies the DNA sample of the criminal and finds their information about his possible characteristics, such as skin color, eyes, hair, and so on. Often, such portraits will turn out very similar to real DNA owners, although there are exceptions. Portraits of Lindy's killer were distributed through the media. Investigators hoped that someone would recognize this man, but in the end they did not receive a single serious lead. A year later, they again approached Parabon with a request to use genetic genealogy. It is also a relatively new method that allows experts to find possible relatives of any person using their DNA. Investigators gave them the genetic sample of Lindy's killer and waited. The main disadvantage of this method is the incredible complexity of the study. Experts have to study thousands of people, weeding out unsuitable candidates, until they finally manage to find a relative of the DNA owner. After many months of painstaking work, they were able to find a person who is distantly related to the killer. He turned out to be a resident of Italy, and now investigators could begin to analyze his pedigree. They were looking for a man who, in 1975, was in the United States and lived near Lancaster. To do this, they had to find and interview a huge number of relatives. In Lancaster alone, there lived 2,500 people who were distantly related to the killer. And in 2022, detectives finally found a suitable candidate. He turned out to be 68-year-old David Sinopole, a man who never came to the attention of the police in this case. In 1975, he lived in the same complex as the victim, so the man immediately became the main suspect. To confirm or deny his involvement, detectives needed to quietly obtain a DNA sample. For this, they began to monitor David, waiting for the right moment. On February 11, they had such an opportunity. A man took off from Philadelphia Airport and threw a paper coffee cup into the trash before boarding the flight. Investigators took him away and transferred him to the laboratory. Experts extracted his DNA sample and compared it with semen found on Lindy's underwear. The analysis showed a complete match. David was the killer. He was arrested on July 17, 2022, and now he is waiting here. He was 21 years old at the time of Lindy's murder. He had moved into the apartment complex a year before the victim moved there with her husband. David W. was married twice, 1972 and 1987. According to available information, he did not have children. He worked most of his life at a printing press in a local printing industry, and colleagues were shocked that their good friend turned out to be a ruthless killer. David is currently in custody, but now there is practically no doubt that he is the killer. Experts also compared his DNA with the blood found in the victim's apartment, and the analysis showed a complete match. Lindy's ex-husband and her brother thanked investigators for being able to get to the bottom of the truth. And now the culprit will be punished. Thus, this complex and confusing case was solved with the help of innovative technologies. Almost 47 years later,